I want to welcome everyone to Revolution Books Online. Revolution Books is a beacon for a whole new world. And tonight's program is a very special one with Martín Espada, poet of the political imagination. And I want to say a few words by way of introduction about the whole situation that we're confronting right now. This program with Martín is happening at an unprecedentedly dangerous situation, an unprecedentedly dangerous time, a pivot moment in history, a pivot point in history. The Trump-Pence regime has a strategy to stay in power and to hammer in place a full-out fascist program. And this is a program that will shatter the rule of law, the right of protest, basic rights of the people, and they are bound and determined to barrel ahead with their white supremacist, male supremacist, anti-LGBTQ agenda, with their immigrant hating, science denying, planet destroying agenda. This is what they're doing. And for them, what's happening next week when the elections take place is not simply an election, it is a coup, a rolling coup that they have been mounting. And they are aiming, to secure their hold on power. And they are moving in various directions. They've stacked the Supreme Court with the third Christian theocrat, Amy Coney Barrett, both to carry forward their agenda and also because this is where they see the election getting settled through the Supreme Court and the machinations that are underway. They are working to suppress votes, aiming and targeting Black and Latino communities. And they are prepared to send their thugs, their militias, their henchmen to polling stations to intimidate and to prevent people from voting this regime out of power. So this is a moment that we're at, and this is a time where we have to massively vote for Biden and vote this regime out of power. But you cannot vote it out of power because they are stealing the election. So while we have to have that huge mandate of opposition to Trump, Pence, and this fascist regime, people have to take to the streets and stay in the streets now, in our hundreds, thousands, tens and hundreds of thousands around the demand Trump, Pence out now. This is where our strength lies, in the power of our numbers in the streets. And this will create the most favorable conditions for us to carry the struggle forward, to drive this fascist regime from power and to prevent the full out consolidation of fascism. And I would encourage everyone to go to revcom.us and watch last night's episode of the Revolution Nothing Less program, where you can learn more about this whole analysis of what we are confronting and the call from refusefascism.org for people to go into the streets, to stay in the streets, so that we can drive this regime from power. These are the stakes. These are stakes for humanity, for the planet, and it's on us to act. And tonight's program is one of a series of emergency programs that we at Revolution Books have been holding, entitled 60 Defiant Days from Revolution Books, Talks, Dialogue, Performance. In the name of humanity, the Trump-Pence regime must go. And the purpose of this programming is to deepen people's understanding of what we are confronting in this fascist regime and what the implications are for all of humanity. To raise people's resolve, to heighten people's resolve, to fight fascism, to stop fascism, before it's too late, to raise people's sights to the revolution that humanity needs, and, as we will see tonight, to give voice to the creative and poetic spirit in these times of danger. So I want to formally introduce Martín and our program tonight. As I said, we're very excited to welcome Martín Espada and his reading, recitation, his performance, his set, Poet of the Political Imagination. And I want to emphasize that Martín's books are available at the Revolution Books online platform. That's revolutionbooksnyc.org. And I want to say a little bit about Martín's work and the incredible background of what he is bringing to us tonight. Martín has written more than a dozen collections of poetry, eight essay collections and anthologies. He's has a storied life. He has been a reporter, a tenant lawyer, an activist and a teacher. He is a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And we know his poetry and his essays make a difference. In 1998, his book Zapata's Disciple was banned in Tucson, Arizona, as part of the outline of Mexican-American studies in Arizona at that time. Martín is a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He is an American Book Association winner, and he is the recipient of the 2018 Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize, which recognizes a lifetime of achievement in poetry. His books, as I said, are available. Viva's Republic of Poetry, his new anthology of poems speaking to the horrors of the Trump regime. These books are available online, and we are very excited to announce that the forthcoming book from which Martín will be reading, Floaters, can be pre-ordered through Revolution Books. So Martín has been a friend of Revolution Books. Before we started the program tonight, he recounted readings that he has given at and for Revolution Books. And when Trump issued his racist denunciation, vilification of people from what he called shithole countries, Revolution Books had a special event in solidarity with the people of those countries. And we called on Martín to send us a poem, and he did, and that was an incredible contribution to that evening. So Martín is a poet of defiance, of empathy with the oppressed, and a poet who finds our common humanity in the lives and in the hopes and the aspirations of those around the world for a better and for a profoundly different life on this planet. So with that, I hand the platform over, the mic, to Martín Espada, and we welcome you through Revolution Books Online, and you are going to hear 45, 50 minutes of incredible poetry from Martín Espada, poet of the political imagination.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you, Reiko. Thank you, Revolution Books. And thank you, everyone out there tonight. Buenas noches, bienvenidos a todos. We're here 1 week before the election, and there's so much I want to say. The best way I can say it is with poetry. And so that's what you're going to be hearing from me tonight. And as Raymond mentioned, you're going to be hearing me read from a forthcoming collection to be published by W.W. Norton in January, but it can be pre-ordered now. And it is indeed called Floaters. This is it. And you can see that there's a photograph on the cover, photograph taken by my father, the late documentary photographer, Frank Espada. And so I'll be reading That'll be followed by Q&A, and we'll go from there. And let's start by looking at the present in the light of the past, by looking at the moment in the light of history. And I'll speak of our collective history, but my personal history in particular. We all know about what has been happening during the Trump regime on the southern border of this country. We all know about the migrants who have come across that border, who have been incarcerated by ICE or have been forced back across that border into refugee camps. Many of those, if not most of those, coming across the southern border have been coming from the countries of Central America. And this causes me to reflect back 30 years and more, back to the Reagan days and beyond. Between 1987 and 1993, I was working as a tenant lawyer in Greater Boston. In fact, I was supervisor of a program called Su Clínica Legal. Su Clínica Legal was a legal services program for low-income Spanish-speaking tenants in a city called Chelsea, Massachusetts, a tough little town right across the Tobin Bridge from Boston, the gateway city, a city of immigrants. It always has been. In those days, the immigrants indeed were coming from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. But more and more, they were coming from Central America, from El Salvador, from Honduras, from Nicaragua, from Guatemala. And the same people coming today. And so I began reflecting on the present in the light of the past, how much has changed and how little has changed, and how much struggle still needs to happen. So the first half of this poem is based on an actual incident that occurred in Chelsea and on the Mystic Tobin Bridge. The second half reflects on the most notorious murder case in the history of Boston, the Chuck Stewart murder case, a white man who killed his wife, blamed it on an imaginary black carjacker, and almost got away with it. This is called Jumping Off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. I close my eyes and see him windmilling his arms as he plummets from the Mystic Tobin Bridge to prove me wrong, to show me he was good, to atone for sins like seeds in the lopsided apple of his heart, but mostly to escape from me in the back of his cab, a Puerto Rican lawyer in a suit and tie. I hated the 111 bus, sweltering in my suit and tie with the crowd in the aisle, waiting to hit a bump on the Mystic Tobin Bridge so my head would finally burst through the ceiling like a giraffe on a circus train. I hated the 111 bus after eviction day in Chelsea District Court, translating the landlords and judges into Spanish so the tenants knew they had to stuff their clothing into garbage bags and steal away again, away from the 40-watt squint that followed them everywhere, that followed me because I stood beside them in court. I would daydream in the humidity of the bus, a basketball hero, flipping the balled up pages of the law into the wastebasket at the office as the legal aid lawyers chanted my name. I hated the 111 bus. I had to take a taxi cab that day. "What the hell are you doing here?" said the driver of the cab to me in my suit and tie. "You gotta be careful in this neighborhood. There's a lot of Jose's around here." The driver's great-grandfather staggered off a boat so his great-grandson could one day drive me across the Mystic Tobin Bridge, but there was no room in the taxi for chalk and a blackboard. He could hear the sawing of my breath as I leaned into his ear past the bulletproof barricade somehow missing and said, "I'm a Jose." I could see the 40-watt squint in his rearview mirror. "I'm Puerto Rican," I said. It was exactly 5 p.m. and we were stuck in traffic in a taxi on the Mystic Tobin Bridge. The driver stammered his own West Side story without the ballet, how a Puerto Rican gang stole his cousin's wallet years ago. You think I'm going to rob you? I said in my suit and tie, close enough now to tickle his ear with the mouth of a revolver. I could hear the sawing of his breath. He still wanted to know what I was doing there. I'm a lawyer. I go to court with all the Jose's, I said. Stalled traffic steamed around us, the breath of cattle in the winter air. Where you going for the holidays? The driver said. I thought about Christmas Eve in court, eviction orders flying from the judge's bench when tenants without legal aid lawyers or children old enough to translate the English of the summons did not answer to their names. Every year, the legal aid lawyers told a joke about the Christmas defense. Your Honor, it's Christmas. I said to the driver, I will be spending Christmas right here with my fellow Jose's. The driver shouted, What do you want me to do? Get out of this cab and jump off the bridge? We both knew what he meant. We both knew about Chuck Stewart, the last man to jump off the mystic Tobin Bridge. Everybody knew how Chuck drove his wife to Mission Hill after birthing classes, the flash and pop in the dark when he shot her in the head and himself in the belly. Everybody knew how he conjured a black carjacker and the crackling call to 911, the way the Mercury Theater on the Air conjured Martians in New Jersey half a century before. Everybody knew how 100 cops pounded on door after door in the projects of Mission Hill, locking a black man in a cage for the world to see like the last of his tribe on exhibit at the World's Fair. Everybody knew how Chuck would have escaped cashing the insurance check to drive away with a new Nissan, but for his brother's confession, the accomplice throwing the Gucci bag with makeup, the wedding rings, and the gun off the dizzy bridge in Revere. Everybody knew how Chuck parked his new car on the lower deck, left a note, and launched himself deep into the black water, how the cops hauled his body from the river by lunchtime when I walked into the office to tell the secretary, Chuck Stewart just jumped off the mystic Tobin Bridge. I said nothing to the driver. I almost nodded yes in the rearview mirror. I confess, for a flash, I wanted him to jump. The driver, the cops, the landlords, the judges, all wanted us to jump off the mystic Tobin Bridge, all wanted us to sprout gills like movie monsters so we could paddle underwater back to the islands, down into the weeds and mud at the bottom, past the fish-plucked rib cages of the dead, the rusty revolvers of 1,000 crimes unsolved, the wedding rings of marriages gone bad, till we washed up on shore in a tangle of seaweed, gasping for air. Last night, still more landed here, clothing stuffed in garbage bags to flee the god of hurricanes flinging their houses into the sky, or the god of hunger slipping his knife between the ribs. Not a dark tide like the tide of the mystic river, but builders of bridges. You can walk across the bridges they build, or you can jump. And they come. And they keep coming. They come because of what they are fleeing. They come because of what this country might possibly be. And that sometimes means, of course, they take their lives in their hands. This brings me to the next poem. It's the title poem of this forthcoming collection, Floaters. And I'm sure many people out there remember a photograph, and it went viral a year ago, last July of 2019. It was a father and daughter, two Salvadoran migrants, drowned in the Rio Grande. And this photograph generated an outpouring of grief. It generated outrage. It also generated trutherism. It generated right-wing conspiracy theories, one of which was articulated on the website of the I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group, an anonymous post questioning whether or not this in fact was fake news. And this, of course, itself made news. And so I responded both to the photograph and to this post. So this is the poem that came out of it. The title in turn comes from an expression often used by members of the Border Patrol to describe those who have drowned attempting to cross over. And that's where we get floaters. Epigraph. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask, have y'all ever seen floaters this clean? I'm not trying to be an ass, but I have never seen floaters like this. Could this be another edited photo? You've all seen the Dems and liberal parties do some pretty sick things. Anonymous post, I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group. Like a beer bottle thrown into the river by a boy too drunk to cry, like the shard of a styrofoam cup drained of coffee brown as the river, like the plank of a fishing boat broken in half by the river, the dead float. And the dead have a name. Floaters, say the men of the Border Patrol, keeping watch all night by the river, hearts pumping coffee as they say the word floaters, soft as a bubble, hard as a shoe as it nudges the body to see if it breathes, to see if it moans, to see if it sits up and speaks. And the dead have names. A feast day parade of names, names that dress all in red, names that twirl skirts, names that blow whistles, names that shake rattles, names that sing in praise of the saints. Say, Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say, Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. See how they rise off the tongue, a calling of bird to bird somewhere in the trees above our heads, trilling in the dark heart of the leaves. Say what we know of them now they are dead. Oscar slapped dough for pizza with oven blistered fingers. Daughter Valeria sang, banging a toy guitar. He slipped free of the apron he wore in the blast of the oven, sold the motorcycle he would kick till it sputtered to life, counted off pesos for the journey across the river, and the last of his 25 years, and the last of her 23 months. There is another name that beats its wings in the heart of the trees. Say, Tanya, Vanessa, Avalos, Oscar's wife and Valeria's mother, the witness, stumbling along the river. Now, their names rise off her tongue. Say, Oscar y Valeria. He swam from Matamoros across to Brownsville. The girl slung around his neck stood hurt in the weeds on the Texas side of the river, swore to return with her mother in hand, turning his back as fathers do, who later say, I turned around and she was gone. In the time it takes for a bird to hop from branch to branch, Valeria jumped in the river after her father. Maybe he called out her name as he swept her up from the river. Maybe the river drowned out his voice as the water swept them away. Tanya called out the names of the saints, but the saints drowsed in the stupor of birds in the dark, their cages covered with blankets. The men on patrol would never hear their pleas for asylum, watching for floaters, hearts pumping coffee all night on the Texas side of the river. No one, they say, had ever seen floaters this clean. Oscar's black shirt yanked up to the armpits, Valeria's arms slung around her father's neck. Even after the light left her eyes, both face down in the weeds back on the Mexican side of the river. Another edited photo. See how her head disappears in his shirt, the waterlogged diaper bunched in her pants, the blue of the blue cans. The radio warned us about the crisis actors we see at one school shooting after another. The man called Oscar will breathe, sit up, speak, tug the black shirt over his head, shower off the mud, and shake hands with the photographer. Yet the floaters did not float down the Rio Grande like Olympians showing off the backstroke, nor did their souls float up to Dallas, land of rumored jobs and a president shot in the head as he waved from his motorcade. No bubbles rose from their breath in the mud, light as the iridescent circles of soap that would fascinate a 2-year-old. And the dead still have names. Names that sing in praise of the saints, names the flower in blossoms of white, a cortege of names dressed all in black, trailing the coffins to the cemetery, carved their names in headlines and gravestones they would never know in the kitchens of this cacophonous world. Enter their names in the book of names. Say Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. Bury them in a corner of the cemetery named for the sainted Archbishop of the Poor, shot in the heart, saying Mass, bullets bought by the taxes I paid when I worked as a bouncer and fractured my hand 40 years ago, and bumper stickers read, El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. When the last bubble of breath escapes the body, may the men who speak of floaters, who have never seen floaters this clean, float through the clouds to the heavens, where they paddle the air as they wait for the saint who flips the keys on his ring like a drowsy janitor till he fingers the key that turns the lock and shuts the gate on their babble-tongued faces, and they plunge back to earth, a shower of hailstones pelting the river, the Mexican side of the river. Well, if indeed there has been oppression along the border, there has also been resistance. It has recently come back into the news that we've had kids in cages. Imagine that. That more than 500 of these children still have not been reunited with their deported parents. And that in turn brings me back to a time not that long ago when there were internment camps in this country holding literally thousands of adolescent migrants. One such camp was in Tornillo, Texas. And the reason I want to read this next poem is not just because it's been in the news recently, this business of kids in cages, but because the site at Tornillo, that internment camp, was subjected to protest, and it worked. Protest works. Resistance works. It can start with a handful of people, a handful of voices. In this case, it began with a man named Josh Rubin and his lonely vigil at Tornillo. It began with organizations in Texas like the Hope Border Institute and their advocacy director, Camilo Perez Bustillo, a good friend of mine, who would go into this internment camp where thousands of adolescent migrants are housed and interview them and heard from them their story of resistance, the way in which these adolescents decided to fight back by playing soccer. And so this is the poem that came out of it after the protests had shut down those camps. It's a poem based on those interviews and based on the photographs I saw coming out of the camp. And it's called Ode to the Soccer Ball Sailing Over a Barbed Wire Fence. Epigraph: Tornillo has become the symbol of what may be the largest U.S. mass detention of children not charged with crimes since the World War II internment of Japanese Americans. Robert Moore, Texas Monthly. Praise Tornillo, word for screw in Spanish, word for jailer in English, word for 3,000 adolescent migrants incarcerated in camp. Praise the 3,000 soccer balls gift wrapped at Christmas as if raindrops in the desert inflated and bounced through the door. Praise the soccer games rotating with a whistle every 20 minutes so 3,000 adolescent migrants could take turns kicking a ball. Praise the boys and girls who walked 1,000 miles, blood caked in their toes, yelling in Spanish and a dozen Mayan tongues on the field. Praise the first teenager, brain ablaze like chili pepper Christmas lights, to kick a soccer ball high over the chain link and barbed wire fence. Praise the first teenager to scrawl a name and number on the face of the ball, then boot it all the way to the dirt road on the other side. Praise the smirk of teenagers at the jailers scooping up fugitive soccer balls, jabbering about the ingratitude of teenagers at Christmas. Praise the soccer balls sailing over the barbed wire fence, white and black like the moon, yellow like the sun, blue like the world. Praise the soccer ball flying to the moon, flying to the sun, flying to other worlds, flying to Antigua, Guatemala, where Starbucks buys coffee beans. Praise the soccer ball bounding off the lawn at the White House, thudding off the president's head as he waves to absolutely no one. Praise the piñata of the president's head, jelly beans pouring from his ears, enough to feed 3,000 adolescents incarcerated at Tornillo. Praise Tornillo, word in Spanish for adolescent migrant internment camp, abandoned by jailers in the desert, liberated by a blizzard of soccer balls. And you probably noticed who put in a guest appearance at the end of that poem. I'm referring, of course, to the soon-to-be former president of the United States, Donald Trump. I'm referring to his enormously cruel immigration policy. Of course, between him and Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, we know who's to blame. But it began long before Donald Trump was elected president. He has a long history. It began, in fact, with the declaration of his candidacy. It began on June the 16th, 2015, when he announced that he was running for president and in the process slandered Mexican immigrants as criminals, as rapists, and set the tone for everything to come after that. So this next poem is about the first hate crime committed in the name of Donald Trump. It didn't happen in Arkansas, it didn't happen in Georgia, it didn't happen in Mississippi. It happened in Boston, Massachusetts. The victim was a Mexican immigrant. And the attackers were inspired directly, as they claimed, by the words of Donald Trump. So this poem is called Not for Him, the Fiery Lake of the False Prophet. Epigraph: when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. Donald Trump, June 16, 2015. They woke him up by pissing in his face. He opened his mouth to scream in Spanish, so his mouth became a urinal at the ballpark. Scott and Steve, the Leader brothers, celebrating a night at Fenway where the Sox beat the Indians and a rookie named Rodriguez spun the scenes on his changeup to hypnotize the tribe. Later that night, Steve urinated on the door of his cell, and Scott told the cops why they did it. Donald Trump was right. All these illegals need to be deported. He was a Mexican in a sleeping bag outside JFK Station on a night in August, so they called him a wetback and emptied their bladders in his hair. In court, the lawyers spoke his name, Guillermo Rodriguez, immigrant with papers, crop picker in the fields, trader of bottles and cans collected in his cart. Two strangers squashed the cartilage in his nose like a can drained of beer. In dreams, he would remember the shoes digging into his rib cage, the pole raked repeatedly across his cheekbones, and upraised knuckles, the high five over his body. Donald Trump was right, said Scott. And Trump said, the people that are following me are very passionate. His hands fluttered as he spoke. A demagogue's hands, no blood under the fingernails, no whiff of urine to scrub away. He would orchestrate the chant of "Build that wall" at rally after rally, bellowing till the blood rushed to his face, red as a demagogue in the grip of masturbatory dreams. A tribute to the new conquistador, the wall raised up by Mexican hands, Mexican hair and fingernails bristling in the brick, Mexican blood swirling in the cement like raspberry syrup on a vanilla sundae. On the Cinco de Mayo, he leered over a taco bowl at Trump Tower. Not for him, the fiery lake of the false prophet reddening his ruddy face. Not for him, the devils of Puritan imagination shrieking in a foreign tongue and climbing in the window like the immigrant demons he conjures for the crowd. Not even for him, 10,000 years of the Leader brothers streaming a fountain of piss in his face as he sputters forever. For him, hell is a country where the man in a hard hat paving the road to JFK Station sees Guillermo and dials 911. Hell is a country where EMTs kneel to wrap a blanket around the shivering shoulders of Guillermo and wipe his face clean. Hell is a country where the nurse at the emergency room hangs a morphine drip for Guillermo so he can go back to sleep. 2,000 miles away, someone leaves a trail of water bottles in the desert for the border crossing of the next Guillermo. We smuggle ourselves across the border of a demagogue's dreams. Confederate generals on horseback tumble one by one into the fiery lake of false prophets. Into the fiery lake crumbles the demolished wall. Thousands stand sledgehammers in hand to await the bullhorns, and handcuffs await the trembling revolvers. In the full moon of the flashlight, every face interrogates the interrogator. In the full moon of the flashlight, every face is the face of Guillermo. And of course, it didn't end there. Let us not forget, although this is not his focus at the moment, that Donald Trump not only built his empire on the backs of Mexicans and Central Americans, but on the backs of Muslims, on the backs of people who he demonized as terrorists. And this next poem is in memory of that, but focused through the prism of one person's experience, which is the way I like to do it. It's a poem for a friend of mine. He's a professor at UMass Amherst. He is from Lebanon. His name is Mazen Naous. He has been the person I go to over and over again when I want to know what's going to happen next in this country, because he lived through 15 years of civil war in Lebanon. And so this is a poem for him, and it's called Mazen Sleeps with His Foot on the Floor, from Mazen Naus. Mazen sleeps with his foot on the floor, trailing off the bed. He does not dream of dancing in Beirut. He does not hear his mother's oud hanging on the wall, belly round like a pear, or fig, or teardrop, strings cascading the ancient music. Whenever the rockets and the bombs shook the house, Mazen and his brother would jump from bed and sprint to the basement. The first step could keep the boys one step ahead of the ceilings and walls collapsing in dusty clouds behind them. Mazen would sleep with his foot on the floor. So he slept for 15 years in the roaring music of Beirut. I remember the air raid drills of my boyhood. The bald Russians would bomb us. The bearded Cubans would bomb us. We stood in the hallways at school, 2 lines facing the walls, because the bombs would fall between us in the middle of the hallway. The teachers told us to be silent, and we were silent, except for the boy who chattered at me, until the music teacher, who loved operettas and forced us to listen, smacked the boy into the wall. He was the only casualty. The civil war in Lebanon is gone, and Mazen gone from Lebanon. Another teacher walking his dog on campus, navigating between the chain link fences with their cranes and boarded buildings, signs everywhere in red, warning, danger. At the airport in Boston, Mazen's skin will glow as if saying, danger, and the wands will pass over his body, scrutinized by agents who would rather scan his mind for the clouds of bombs and rockets he conspires to drop on them. Mazen still sleeps with his foot on the floor. He knows what we only think we know. The Civil War gone, but not gone. How the first step can save us when the walls dissolve like baking powder, even as we block out the rumbling, staring, hypnotized by the icy pond of the screen. So we're seeing what we're seeing, and it is new, and yet it is not new. And in some ways, it's been there all along, of course, going back centuries. And I can certainly remember moments in my own adolescence where the lesson came across to me in subtle ways, or not so subtle. So this book also includes some personal poems, some family poems. I'm going to read a short poem from the middle of the book, which speaks to these themes. And it's called Asking Questions of the Moon. Epigraph. Some blind girls ask questions of the moon, and spirals of weeping rise through the air. Federico Garcia Lorca. As a boy, I stood guard in right field, lazily punching my glove, keeping watch over the ball game and the moon as it rose from the infield, asking questions of the moon about the girl with long blonde hair in the back of my classroom, who sat with me when no one else would, who talked to me when no one else would, who laughed at my jokes when no one else would, until the day her friend sat beside us and whispered to her behind that long hair, and the girl asked me as softly as she could, Are you a spick? And I, with a hive of words in my head, could only think to say, yes, I am. She never spoke to me again. And as I thought of her in the outfield, the moon fell from the sky, tore to the webbing of my glove, and smacked me in the eye. Blinded, I wept, kicked the moon at my feet, and loudly blamed the webbing of my glove. Well, in times of hate, we need poems of love. So that's what's coming next. Of course, this being me, and the election being a week away, it's a political love poem. And it's called A Bod with Concussion. Many of us as activists pose this question of ourselves and each other all the time. What can we do to act on our principles every day? What can we do to live our principles? It's one thing to talk about what we believe in, quite another thing to act on it, and quite another thing to act on it every single day. Well, there are people out there doing that. It's not as impossible as it might seem. And I'm thinking now of my wife, Lauren Marie Schmidt, who is a poet in her own right, with 4 books to her credit. She's also a teacher, and for many years taught in urban ed, specifically in Springfield, Massachusetts, and specifically the Puerto Rican community in Springfield, Massachusetts. And this next poem is based on something that happened a couple of years ago, and it reflects what it means to live your principles, what it means to act on what you believe in. And Aubade, by the way, is it's a French verse form, and it refers to, is about lovers parting at dawn. And boy, did we ever. Aubade with concussion. Epigraph. Poverty is black ice. Naomi Ayala. You leave me sleeping in the dark. You kiss me, and I stir. Fingers in your hair, eyes open on seeing. You leave me asleep every morning, commuting to the school in the city at sunrise. The landlord's driveway, a muddy creek, ices over hard after the freezing rain clatters all night. Your feet fly up, your head slamming the ground, an eclipse of the sun flooding your eyes. You sleep under the car. No one knows how long you sleep. You awake with 100 ice picks stabbing your eardrums. You awake, coat and hair soaked, and somehow drive to school. You remember to turn left at the Smith & Wesson factory. The other teachers lead you by the elbow to Mercy Hospital, where you pause when the nurse asks your name, where you claim your pain level is a 4, and they slide you into the white coffin of an MRI machine. You hold your breath. They film your brain. Concussion. The word we use for the boxer plunging face first to the canvas after the uppercut blindsided him, not the teacher commuting to school at sunrise in a Subaru Crosstrek. Yet you would drive, ears hammering as they hammer in the purgatory of the MRI. A week before, Isabella came to you in the classroom and said, "Miss, I cannot sleep. 3 days, I cannot sleep." Her boyfriend called at 2 a.m. and she did not pick up. At 3 a.m., a single shot to the head put him to sleep, and he will sleep forever, his body hidden beneath a car in a parking lot on Maple Street. The cops, the television cameras, the neighbors all gathering at the yellow tape carnival of his corpse. You said to Isabella, take this journal, write it down. You don't have to show me. You don't have to show anyone. On the cover of the journal you bought at the drugstore was the word dream. Isabella sat there in your classroom at your desk, pencil waving in furious circles. By lunchtime, as her friends slapped each other, Isabella slept, head on the desk, face pressed against the pages of the journal. This is why I watch you sleep at 3 a.m. when the sleeping pills fail to quell the strike meeting in my brain. This is why I say to you, when you kiss me in my sleep, don't go, don't go. You have to go. Well, this is also an evening for and about activists, for and about activism. And that means it's an evening when we honor the visionaries. We honor those who could see what we could not see, who could imagine what we could not imagine. Because in spite of everything, so many of them have been proven right over time, over and over. I'm thinking now of a legendary activist in New York City. His name was Luis Garden Acosta. Luis Garden Acosta was a Puerto Rican Dominican activist, community organizer from the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, also known as Los Sures. He was the co-founder of something called El Puente, a multi-purpose community center for youth and others in that section of Brooklyn for the Latino community. And I remember the first time Luis, who would become a great mentor and friend to me, brought me to the abandoned church where he intended to create this community center, this El Puente, for a community that had been abandoned by all but a few. And he was one of them, a visionary. The poem is called Morissoniando, that literally translates to die dreaming, also national drink of the Dominican Republic. So, Morir Soñando for Luis Garden Acosta, 1945 to 2019, Brooklyn, New York. I saw the empty cross atop the empty church on South 4th Street, as if Jesus flapped his arms and flew away, spooked by one ambulance siren too many. I saw the stained glass windows I wanted to break with a brick, the mural of St. Mary and the angels hovering innocent as spies over the congregation. I wanted to know why you brought me here, the son of a man punched in the face by a priest for questioning the Trinity, who punched him back. This is El Puente, you said, the bridge. I knew about the Williamsburg Bridge, 8 lanes of traffic and the subway stampeding in the open windows of the barrio all summer. You spread your arms in that abandoned church and saw the spinning of a carousel better than any wooden horses pumping up and down at Coney Island. Here, the ESL classes for the neighbors cursed with swollen tongues in English. There, the clinics on contraception, the pestilence in the veins of the unsuspecting. Here, the karate lessons, feet spearing the air to keep schoolyard demons away. There, the dancers in white swirling their skirts to the drumming of bomba. Here, the workshops on Puerto Rican history, La Masacre de Ponce, where your mother's beloved painted his last words on the street with a fingertip of blood. I was a law student, first year, memorizing law school Latin, listening to classical guitar on my boombox as I studied the rules of property. It's mine, it's not yours. I saw only what could be proven by a preponderance of the evidence. The church abandoned by the church, the cross atop the church abandoned by the Son of God. My belly empty as St. Mary of the Angels. I told you I was hungry, and we left. I wanted Chinese food, but you told me about the Chinese takeout down the block where you stood behind a man who shrieked about the price of wonton soup, left, and returned with a can of gasoline, splashed it on the floor, and pulled a box of kitchen matches from his pocket. Will you wait till I pick up my egg roll and pork fried rice? You said, with a high school teacher's exasperated authority. So he did. You could talk an arsonist into postponing his inferno till you left with lunch, but you couldn't raise the dead in the ER at Greenpoint Hospital, even in your student high. You couldn't convince the girl called Sugar to rise from the gurney after the gunshot drained the blood from her body. You couldn't persuade the doctor who peeled his gloves and shook his head to bring her back to life, telling him, do it again. An arsonist in medical scrubs trying to strike a wet match. You couldn't jumpstart the calliope in her heart so the carousel of horses would rise and fall and rise again. Whenever you saw the gutted church, you would see the sheets of the gurney dipped in red, all the gurneys rolling into the ER with a sacrifice of adolescence. We walked to the luncheonette on Havemeyer Street. A red awning announced, Morir soñando. To die dreaming, you said, from the DR, my father's island. The boy at the counter who spoke no English, brown as my father, called Martín like me, grinned the way you grinned at El Puente once, St. Mary of the Angels. He squeezed the oranges into a drizzle of juice with evaporated milk, cane sugar, and ice, shook the elixir, and poured it till the froth spilled over the lip of the glass. Foam freckled my snout as I raised my hand for another. Intoxicated by Morissoniando number 3 and the prophet gently rocking at my table, I had a vision. ESL classes healing the jaws wired shut by English, clinics full of adolescents studying the secrets of the body, unspeakable in the kitchen or the confessional. Karate students landing bare feet on the mat with a thump and grunt in unison. Bomba dancers twirling to a song in praise of Yoruba gods abolished by the priests. The words of Puerto Rican rebels painted on the walls by brushes dipped in every color, pressed in the pages of notebooks by a generation condemned to amnesia. Morir soñando. Luis, I know you died dreaming of South 4th Street, the banners that said no to the toxic waste plant down the block, or the Navy bombarding an island of fishermen for target practice thousands of miles away. Morir soñando. I know you died dreaming of the gigantes, carnival mascaras bristling with horns that dangle with the angels at El Puente. Morir soñando. I know you died dreaming of the next El Puente. Morir soñando. I know you died dreaming of the hammer's claw, the drill whining to the screw, the dust like snow in a globe, then the shy genius raising her hand in the back of the room. Morir soñando. I know you died dreaming of the poets who stank of weed in the parking lot, then stood before the mic you electrified for them and rubbed their eyes when the faces in their poems gathered there waiting for the first word so we could all die dreaming, Morissoniando, intoxicated by the elixir of the tongue. O rocking prophet at my table. So that's for Luis Carden Acosta and all the visionaries we remember tonight. And I'm going to read one more poem and move on to some questions. This poem also has a visionary in it. His name was Francisco Luis Espada, Frank Espada, my father, who was born in Untitled, Puerto Rico, up in the mountains in 1930, died in Pacifica, California in 2014. And so my father was already gone when Hurricane Maria struck the island of Puerto Rico in the fall of 2017, an anniversary we marked only a short while ago. He was gone, but not gone, as so often happens with the dead. I began talking to my father about what I was seeing, what I saw on television, what I saw on my computer screen, image after image after image of his hometown, his Utuado, where he was born, where my grandmother was born. And I spoke to him as if he could hear me. I spoke to his ashes in a box on my bookshelf. It's easier to speak to the dead if you have their corporeal remains immediately behind you. And so it was that this poem came about, me talking to my father about Hurricane Maria and that other hurricane, Hurricane Trump, because it was due to his criminal and racist negligence that more than 3,000 people, conservatively 3,000, died in Puerto Rico. And let us not forget that, because no one's talking about that anymore during this election. I was glad to see a reference to it in one article. It turns out that the Puerto Rican community in Pennsylvania just might tip the vote to Biden because of what happened in Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria. Let's hope so. It's too late to do anything about Hurricane Maria. It's not too late to do anything about that other hurricane called Trump. And so I'll leave you with this last poem. Letter to my father, October 2017. You once said, my reward for this life would be 1,000 pounds of dirt shoveled in my face. You were wrong. You are 7 pounds of ashes in a box, a Puerto Rican flag wrapped around you next to a red brick from the house in Utuado where you were born, all crammed together on my bookshelf. You taught me there is no God, no life after this life, so I know you are not watching me type this letter over my shoulder. When I was a boy, you were God. I watched from the 7th floor of the projects as you walked down into the street to stop a public execution. A big man caught a small man stealing his car, and everyone in Brooklyn heard the car alarm wail of the condemned. He's killing me. At a word from you, the executioner's hand slipped from the hair of the thief. The kid was high, was all you said when you came back to us. When I was a boy and you were God, we flew to Puerto Rico. You said, my grandfather was the mayor of Utuado. His name was Buenaventura. That means good fortune. I believed in your grandfather's name. I heard the tree frogs chanting to each other all night. I saw a banana leaf and elephant palm sprouting from the mountain's belly. I gnawed the mango's pit and the sweet yellow hair stuck between my teeth. I said to you, "You came from another planet. How'd you do it?" You said, "Every morning, just before I woke up, I saw the mountains." Every morning, I see the mountains. In Utuado, 3 sisters, all in their 70s, all bedridden, all Pentecostales who only left the house for church, lay sleeping on mattresses spread across the floor when the hurricane gutted the mountain the way a butcher slices open a dangled pig, and a rolling wall of mud buried them, leaving the 4th sister to stagger into the street, screaming like an unheeded prophet about the end of the world. In Utuado, a man who cultivated a garden of aguacate and carambola, feeding the avocado and star fruit to his nieces from New York, so the trees in his garden be headed all at once like the soldiers of a beaten army, and so hanged himself. An Utuado, a welder and a handyman, rigged a pulley with a shopping cart to ferry rice and beans across the river where the bridge collapsed, witnessed the cart swaying above so many hands that raised a sign that told the helicopters, "Campamento los olvidados," Camp of the Forgotten. Los olvidados wait 7 hours in line for a government meal of Skittles and Vienna sausage, or a tarp to cover the bones of a house with no roof as the fungus grows on their skin from sleeping on mattresses drenched with the spit of the hurricane. They drink the brown water, waiting for microscopic monsters in their bellies to visit plagues upon them. A nurse says, "These people are going to have an epidemic. These people are going to die." The president flips rolls of paper towels to a crowd at a church in Guaynabo, Zeus lobbing thunderbolts on the locked ward of his delusions. Down the block, cousin Ricardo, Bernice's boy, says that somebody stole his can of diesel. I heard somebody ask you once what Puerto Rico needed to be free, and you said, "Tres pulgadas de sangre en la calle." 3 inches of blood in the street. Now, 3 inches of mud flow through the streets of Utuado, and troops patrol the town as if guarding the vein of copper in the ground, as if a shovel digging graves in the backyard might strike the ore below, as if La Brigada swinging machetes to clear the road might remember the last uprising. I know you are not God. I have the proof. 7 pounds of ashes in a box on my bookshelf. Gods do not die, and yet I want you to be God again. Stride from the crowd to seize the president's arm before another roll of paper towels sails away. Thunder Spanish obscenities in his face. Banish him to a roofless rainstorm in Utuado, so he unravels one soaked sheet after another till there is nothing left but his cardboard heart. I promised myself I would stop talking to you, white box of gray grit. You were deaf even before you died. Hear my promise now. I will take you to the mountains where houses lost like ships at sea rise blue and yellow from the mud. I will open my hands. I will scatter your ashes. En Utuado. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Martín, I want to thank you, and I know the audience wants to thank you for that incredible reading of rage and beauty, powerful, poignant, and I must say, elevating. Can you hear me, Martín?
Yes, I can.
Want to call on the people in the audience, people who are viewing. You can send in questions and comments. We're getting quite a few comments, Martín, of appreciation, bravo, and so moving we've gotten comments like that. I wanted to just start, some discussion, and perhaps the viewers and those who have heard this wonderful, wonderful reading, will have some thoughts. I wanted to, pose a few questions to you. One is of your poetry, and it came through tonight, where there's the very intimate and the personal and the stories that are told and the characters that you draw so vividly. And this is all interacting with larger historical forces, and are able to sort of wrestle with this and synthesize this, where you tell these deeply personal stories and draw out these characters and these very powerful vignettes, and history is sort of thundering all around you. It's just something I'd like to hear you speak a little bit about.
Well, I do believe that there's a difference between history with a capital H and history, the story. That in order to make history concrete, vivid, and real, we have to tell the stories of individual human beings. We have to give history a human face, eyes, nose, mouth, ears. And in so doing, we can actually feel what we call history. And we can take those huge abstractions, whether it's history or justice or love, and make them concrete. Make the if history can make the hair stand up on my arm, if history can make the hair stand up in the back of my neck, then it's doing something that goes beyond what we usually experience when we hear that word or see it written. And right now, I think if we're going to talk about learning from history, taking political action, seeking justice, all these things that seem hopelessly enormous, then we have to be able to boil all of that down to the personal and even the intimate. We have to be able to tell stories, but we have to be able to tell stories of real human beings who live and who die.
Yeah, and Martín, you have said in some interviews and commentary how the stories that you tell are the stories that have been hidden, that have been stolen, the lives of those who have not been known, but who have lived rich lives and who have suffered incredibly. And I think there was a phrase that you used about rescuing those from oblivion. And this is such a animating pulse, it seems, in your work. You ended the poem Floaters, with excuse me, the not for him, the fiery lake of the false prophet. You ended in the full moon of the flashlight. Every face is the face of Guillermo. And there's the bringing to life. And this to me is such a powerful element of your work, this rescuing from oblivion, but the reality of those who have been hidden, who have been suppressed this way.
Yeah, rescue, the phrase that I tend to use over and over is to rescue the dead from oblivion. And you may have noticed how many people, even in that one reading of 9 poems, how many of those people were dead, in fact. And it is something I take on. The dead, by definition, cannot speak for themselves, and yet they still have stories to tell. And the stories they tell to the living are very, very important stories to hear. And it's also simply a way of paying homage, of doing honor I can't bring my father back to life, but the closest I can come is by doing what I can to enliven him through that last poem that you heard. I can't bring Luis Cardenal Costa back to life. Oh, I wish I could. Oh, I wish I could, because Luis would sit there and he would, rocking and smiling, figure out a way to make me feel better about what's going on right now. He would help me to see a way out, um, and to see me as the agent of that change, along with thousands of other people. In that way, Luis had a lot in common with another friend of mine, for whom I wrote an elegy in my last book, and his name was Howard Zinn, and you all know that name. And we need those visionaries, and sometimes we need those visionaries after they're long gone. We need their voices. I really wish I could hear what they have to say about what's happening right now. But since they cannot speak to the present moment, I can at least turn around and speak for them, and try to, I'm not going to say I'm sitting here like a spirit medium, because I don't believe in that. But what poets do sometimes approaches that. I want that voice, and I want that vision to rise again through my words.
There is a question that came in. I want to bring that to you right away. I'm looking for it. Hold on one second. Uh, Someone asked, when you're writing these kinds of poems, how do you hold your emotions in check so that you can actually write the poem? I'm looking for the exact wording of this question. Reiko, if you're there, I can't find this right now. I'm having some
Well,
technical difficulties.
I can answer the paraphrase of the question. Why don't we just go forward with that? How
Yeah.
do I hold my emotions in check when I'm writing poems like these? And first of all, the answer is I don't necessarily hold my emotions in check. Sometimes I rage. Sometimes I cry. But what happens to turn it into a poem? And the reason the emotions can be held in check on the page is because of an approach that I'm taking, which is that approach where I ground everything in the image. I ground everything in the five senses on paper, right? And if I'm doing that, then I'm avoiding the larger abstractions that we tend to employ when our emotions are unchecked, when the rage or the grief has gotten a hold of us, when we're speaking in, and it's not to say that there isn't anger or sadness still present in the poems. It absolutely is. These are not dry intellectual exercises. This is not experimentation. um, but it's a way for me to control, to channel the emotional energy of these experiences and these narratives, is to do so through craft, to do so through the image, do so through the senses on paper. And that's the way, that's the channel they have to pass through. And when that happens, it exercises a certain command over the emotional state that you're in. I should also say that, many of these poems, especially if you're hearing me write poems for the dead, if you're hearing me, read a poem for Luis Garnacotta, or in my previous book, had a number of elegies for my father. They're poems written for occasions where others are grieving. And my role as a poet is not only to rescue the dead from oblivion, as I mentioned before, but to speak to those who are grieving, and to do something if possible to offer consolation. You can't do that if you are, in fact, if everything is just sort of pouring out of you in a volcanic outburst. You are focused on what other people need or other people will take away from that poem. You know, so when I write a poem for an occasion like that, you know, that's also uppermost in my mind.
Another question came in, Martin. Someone asked if you have written or have been moved to write a poem about the uprising in Puerto Rico that drove a hated governor from power, that set a certain example, a model for those, you know, for the situation that we're facing here in the United States, where we have to drive a regime from power by going into the streets. And someone asked, you know, have you given poetic expression what happened, you know, with that upsurge in the streets in Puerto Rico, you know, about a year and a half, 2 years ago?
Yeah, and that's the key. Year and a half, 2 years ago, and the answer is that I almost asked before you specified there, you know, which uprising, because there've been so many, and I have written about so many historically. There's this
Right.
stereotype, pervasive stereotype of Puerto Ricans as being somehow passive people, and nothing could be further from the truth, especially not politically. Puerto Rico, of course, is the oldest colony in the world. 4 centuries under Spain, and now more than a century under the United States since the Spanish-American War of 1898. And whereas I did not write about that last uprising, it's only because I didn't have any direct connection to it. I didn't have the time to sort of absorb it, you might say. And I you know, oftentimes it takes me a while to absorb a subject or a story before I can turn it into a poem. I will say this, that in the forthcoming collection of poems, there is one poem, which certainly was too long to read tonight, but it's called The Five Horses of Dr. Ramon Emeterio Betances. And Dr. Ramon Emeterio Betances was, in fact, a Puerto Rican revolutionary, a writer, and indeed a physician. And the poem is set in Puerto Rico in 1856. He had come back to the island after getting his medical education in Paris and walked right into a cholera epidemic that claimed the lives of approximately 30,000 people, including 10,000 enslaved people. And Betances took it upon himself to not only battle that epidemic, but to battle slavery as well. He founded an abolitionist movement, and as a result of which he was ultimately forced into exile. He would respond by organizing an insurrection in Puerto Rico called the Grito de Lares in 1868. And although that insurrection failed, it imbued the people of Puerto Rico with the fighting spirit that we saw when they ousted this corrupt governor a couple of years ago. And I believe firmly that Puerto Rico one day will be independent, that it will indeed finally realize the vision of Dr. Ramon Emeterio Betances, who saw an independent Puerto Rico in his mind's eye, you know, so many, many years ago.
It looks like Raymond's video is frozen. So I'm going to give him a chance to come back. Ah, there he is.
I'm back.
All right.
Such are the vicissitudes and vagaries of this technology, and we're trying to master it. But sometimes there are conditions that are beyond our control. Rico, maybe you could see if there are any questions coming in. I'm not sure I'm being heard or seen right now.
Well, maybe Rico has a question.
Oh, here I am. I'm back. I'm back. Someone, I just wanted to say, someone wrote in, a number of people did, but wanted to thank you for honoring the Oscar and Valeria, the father and daughter who drowned in the real ground in the poem Floaters. Very touched and moved by this. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you. And let's not forget them. I was quite disturbed by the fact that 1 year after they drowned, on the first anniversary of their drowning, when I would have thought that the media would be full of it, I couldn't find anything. And I remember reading the poem. It might have been on KPFA at Flashpoints and Dennis Bernstein, and pointing that out. That there was, 1 year later, and what we of course are dealing with now is not only the political avalanche that we're under, we're also under a technological avalanche. The screen keeps moving, right? It's whether you're on Facebook or wherever else you may be, the feed keeps going. The world keeps scrolling past us. And that which we should remember, we forget because of this, because of the avalanche that's coming at us all the time. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do when I write a poem like that is make us stop the avalanche, pause, think, feel, reflect, and not forget Oscar and Valeria.
And I think that poem, certainly succeeded in doing that. And, it's on us to act on, what you are bringing to life, that this regime, that is responsible for that drowning is implementing murderous policies right now to seal off the border and carrying out crimes against humanity, torture, the caging of 5,000 children, 5,000 children being caged. This is just beyond description how horrific it is. And you mentioned at the outset the 545 children who it's separated from their parents and whose parents are not to be found now. They're deported. Some of them may have died in the Sonora Desert. We don't know. The administration, this regime, is carrying out this program, and all of this is genocidal, in its implications. So I think what you're doing with these poems is so important. And in one of the interviews, that you've done, someone had quoted W.H. Auden about, well, a poem doesn't do anything. It's just a poem, it's words. And I think that your work and how you present it, just gives lie to this, that, you've written these works of, as I said, rage and beauty, and they enter into the world and they have this effect that you're talking about. And I think that the relationship between the written word, the metaphor, the image, the contemplative, in what that means as far as our acting to change this world that your poem is entering into. I just think that this is so important. You're a signatory to the Pledge of Resistance that has been issued by Refuse and Resist, along with Cornel West and Noam Chomsky, poets like Jessica Care Moore, the great composer, arranger Arturo O Fario. And this Pledge of Resistance is a pledge to unite in our millions. I'm reading from it. Rising together in nonviolent resistance to stop a great horror. We pledge to stay in the streets, overcoming fear and uncertainty until this American fascism is brought to a halt. And here it seems to me that the poet has an extraordinarily important role to play in a moment of darkness and danger like this. And maybe you could say a little more about poems and poets in a moment like this.
Yeah. Well, I'll begin with Auden. Poor Auden. The phrase was, poetry makes nothing happen. It's been taken out of context and twisted and used to justify apathy, indifference, cynicism. You could take the word poetry out of there, and you could plug in all kinds of other things. You could, words make nothing happen. Activism makes nothing happen. Ultimately, these are rationalizations. And when it comes to poetry, we have clear evidence to the contrary. We know, for example, that poets have been part of so many great social movements, and you can see them throughout the 20th century alone. Poets participating in one great social movement after another, or poets who weren't even part of a social movement becoming part of a social movement decades after their death. And, I think the easy example of Wilfred Owen, the great First World War poet, who was killed at the age of 25, 1 week before the end of the war, and who didn't get his due fully, who wasn't really heard fully until the 1960s, when he was rediscovered by people who were taking part in a movement against another war, the war in Vietnam. And all of a sudden, they stumbled across a prophet speaking from beyond the grave in the form of Wilfred Owen. And there are so many poets today, too many poets to name, who are speaking out, who are documenting for future generations what the unbelievable, right? And let's pause for a moment on what it means to even use a word like that, right? Because we can refer to that, the unbelievable or the impossible, in terms of what's happening right now with the Donald Trump regime. And I use the word regime very deliberately because you use that word in reference to demagogues and dictators. But at the same time, what feels unbelievable to us, what feels impossible to us, is that it could ever be different again, right? It feels as if we are going to be stuck in this historical moment forever. And when we look at the projections about this election and what could possibly happen, and the idea that Trump might refuse to leave the White House, or that he may figure out a way through his lawyers to throw this election over to the Supreme Court that's now stacked 6-3 in his favor. It feels like this is never going to end. And yet it's so important for us to think the unthinkable right now, to envision the impossible right now, a world without Donald Trump. And sometimes what that requires is poetry, something that moves us beyond the arguments that we may find in the newspapers, beyond what we might read in even the sort of left liberal newspapers you might read in The Guardian or whatever. Because poetry can do something that an op-ed writer can't do, and I know because I've written op-eds as well. And that is to move us to the point where we can envision what ordinarily we could not. We can imagine the impossible, the unthinkable, the unimaginable, right? It wasn't that long ago when we elected the first African-American president in the history of this country, and without getting into what what became of him and what promises were made, subsequently broken, and so forth. My father was still around for that. And I remember him saying to me, and my father was a civil rights activist for years and years and years. And, he said, I never, never, never dreamed I would see this in my lifetime. That was not that long ago that we did the impossible, the unthinkable, the unimaginable. And if we could do that and elect the first African-American president in our history, we can get rid of this demagogue. We can get rid of this creature in the White House, even though it may feel like the furthest thing right now from reality. And poetry has a role to play in pushing us in that sort of direction.
I think this is really true, what you're saying about the role of poetry in envisioning and re-envisioning and, imagining what is in the current moment declared to be unimaginable and not feasible. And, the back and forth between the imagination and then acting, with a real scientific grasp of what we are facing, to understand the stakes of that, what this means, this regime will mean for world humanity, for the environment, for women, if this, goes forward in terms of the attacks on abortion, on gay people, what this will mean, in terms of we have this demented fascist bully with his finger on the nuclear button. This is how serious this is. And they are, as you said, stealing the election as we speak. And I thought the question coming in from one of the viewers about what happened in Puerto Rico a year and a half, 2 years ago, where people took to the streets. And that was at the time inconceivable that this would happen, but it happened. And people were determined and they got organized. And there is the call from refusefascism.org. I said refuse and resist before, but it's refusefascism.org that had issued this pledge of resistance that Martín is a signatory to. And we are confronted with a situation that is so dangerous, and it is an existential moment. And poems like yours play an important role in helping people to see what is possible and what, as you had said before, what history can tell us about the past and what was confronted and where we are today. And you spoke in one of your poems about a river. I think it was in the Vivas to Those Who Have Failed. And in one of the poems in that collection, it's not an elegy for defeat, as I read, these poems. It's you talk about the lives that become part of a river, and now that river is welling up in the most dangerous moment that we have, confronted, and that is on us, as I said, to act in these conditions. And someone asked about when the new book will be available, Floaters, because you were reading from this, and part of what's been touching off this discussion here are the poems there that you read tonight. So people are asking when this will actually become available. I will let people know that they will be able to pre-order it through Revolution Books. We will have that. Martín, when is it going to be out?
Floaters is scheduled for publication in January. And of course, you can pre-order it, and it will be delivered to your doorstep. So you can do that through Revolution Books, indeed. And yes, and these are poems that will say something about the power of the political imagination. And if you can't imagine this guy gone from the White House, for example, imagine jelly beans pouring from his ears.
Yeah.
If you prefer, if that helps, I mean, we got to remember that one of the most effective tools in terms of bringing the demagogue down to size is mockery. And that's not a coincidence that in my ode to the soccer ball sailing over a barbed wire fence, that's what happens to him. That soccer ball hits him in the head, kicked all the way from Tornillo, Texas, and jelly beans pour out of his ears, enough to feed 3,000 adolescent migrants. That's a lot of jelly beans. So if it helps to see him that way, see him that way. You know, we got to figure out different ways to cut him down to size. All part and parcel of getting rid of this guy piece by piece.
I'm looking at some of the questions that are coming in, comments. Someone wrote in, Morissoniando was stunning, breathtaking.
Thank you.
Someone asked here a little earlier, someone asked about how you put the 5 senses down on paper.
Well, there are tools for doing that. You know, reliance upon metaphor and simile, right? Reliance on forms of comparison in order to make that possible. Forms of reliance on certain kinds of adjectives, diction. By diction, I don't mean enunciation. I mean vocabulary. And that's, you know, what particulars, specifics, being as precise and accurate as possible. That's what it means when I say, you know, when I say putting the senses on paper. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what sets it aside from a political poem that falls into the usual mistakes. You know, we you know, there. Look, we all know there are a lot of bad political poems out there. Not that it, you know, I mean, there are a lot of bad poems of all kinds. There are a lot of bad love poems too. There are bad poems about trees. There are bad poems that are about nothing. That's the biggest category of bad poems, the ones about nothing. So I'm not singling out political poems. I'm saying that there's a way of writing a political poem where you employ a craft that brings it closer to realizing what it is you want to express. Practice, practice, practice. Been doing this for a long time.
Speaking of which, the art of writing poetry, someone asked, where do you teach and what do you teach?
I am a professor in the Department of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I have been since 1993. That's 27 years. It was prior to that I worked as a tenant lawyer in Greater Boston, which I alluded to at the beginning of my reading. And I teach creative writing, of course. I also teach, and I'm teaching this semester, a course called Poetry of the Political Imagination, which is a survey course and takes a representative sample of poets who are out there in the world, living and dead, and uses those poets to illustrate various principles of this thing I'm calling poetry of the political imagination. And so it opens, in fact, and has always opened with the unit on war. So I begin with Wilfred Owen, and I go on to the war in Vietnam, and a poet by the name of Doug Anderson. There are African American poets, a series of poems concerning the Jim Crow South and the history of the Jim Crow South, written by Sterling Brown, Marilyn Nelson. There are contemporary poets writing about the same issues, such as John Murillo and Araceli Shirmay. There are poets, Puerto Rican poets, Jack Agüeros, who was a second father to me. The great Julia de Burgos, who was translated by Agüeros. Carolyn Forche, country between us. Ernesto Cardenal, great poet from Nicaragua. And this coming week, I am teaching prison poetry of the great Turkish poet Nazım Hikmet. I've also brought in guests. I just the other day had the distinct pleasure of bringing my wife, Lauren Marie Schmidt, in as a guest from the next room to read from her collection called Filthy Labors from Northwestern University Press, also a poet of the political imagination. And so, that's what I do at UMass.
At this point, I think we're going to, I want to say a few words about Revolution Books and our great need for funds. And we'll see if any further questions come in, at this point. But I do want to once again thank you for this wonderful and extremely uplifting reading and discussion. And we've heard your poems, and we've heard, something about the process of producing these poems, and what is that creative process all about, and what does that mean at this moment in history to be writing this kind of poetry. So I want to call on people in the audience, and we're counting on people in the audience to support Revolution Books and its critical work. We are a unique resource, a beacon for a whole new world at a time when Trump-Pence fascism must be stopped. And as people can appreciate tonight, this is a place, a bookstore, that values critical thinking, the poetic spirit, and the struggle for the truth. It's a place where people bring their biggest questions, bring their insights, and where we wrestle together to understand why the world is the horror that it is and how it can be transformed through revolution. And the beating heart of Revolution Books is the work and leadership of Bob Avakian. He has brought forward, he has developed a radically new framework for human emancipation. This is the new communism, the scientific method and approach to understand the world deeply in order to transform it profoundly and to make a revolution to emancipate all of humanity. So I encourage everyone to come to Revolution Books in New York City, in Harlem, and in Berkeley, to go online, to get the books, to get Bob Avakian's work, at Revolution Books. And he has been writing incredible analyses of this current moment and the urgent responsibilities before us to drive this regime from power and how that could happen, a vision of how that can happen. So, Revolution Books is this resource, but we can't be that resource without your support, without making a donation, without becoming a sustainer. People can donate at revolutionbooksnyc.org. They can go to Venmo. They can do a Venmo donation. That would be Venmo at REV Books NYC. They can do it through Cash App at $Rev Books NYC. And your support makes it possible to hold more programs like tonight's with Martín, and to promote and to catapult these events to a much wider audience. And that's especially important at this time of 60 defiant days in our programming, which is being done in conjunction with the call from refusefascism.org for people to go into the streets, to stay into the streets around the demand, Trump, Pence out now. So your support will help us to do more programs and to promote more programs like this. It will enable us to recover, to help recover the sales that we lost as a result of this pandemic, and to restock our shelves with books that matter, with books like Martín's poetry. And again, people can go on our platform to order those books. And we're doing all of this to take on the great, great, momentous challenges that we face right now, focused up in driving this horrific fascist regime from power. So again, I ask you and urge you to donate, to sustain, to let people know about Revolution Books. Put us on your Instagram, tell your friends and colleagues about it, and get in touch and get involved and send us your ideas and suggestions. And I want people to know that we will be having more programs coming up. Watch your calendar, look for our emails, go onto the revolutionbooksnyc.org website. We are going to have a cello concert from Berkeley, a composition that written by an African-American composer, and this is going to be as part of the struggle to oust the Trump-Pence regime from power. And we are going to have an artist talk with a performance artist who has been putting on these events around the life of Ona Judge, the enslaved woman that was fled George Washington's plantation. So these are the things that are coming up. And I want to urge everyone to go to refusefascism.org to become hooked up with and connected with this great movement, to go into the streets and stay in the streets to drive the Trump-Pence regime from power and to stop fascism before it is too late. And I want to go out thanking Martín Espada for this truly moving, truly enlightening, and truly inspiring reading. We want to have you back soon. We want to have you back in the brick and mortar stores of Revolution Books Berkeley, Revolution Books Harlem, when that becomes possible. And if you want to say any parting words, Martín, please do so. And on behalf of the staff, and I know everyone in the audience, we are so grateful for what you have done tonight.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I'd like to thank you, Raymond. I'd like to thank Reiko. I'd like to thank Jesse. I'd like to thank Revolution Books New York and Berkeley. And again, I'd like to thank everyone out there, whether you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube or wherever. And after all those poetic words, let me leave you by stating the obvious. Vote if you haven't voted already.